who meets in a strange place an Ethiopian. And as we read this passage, there's one line in the passage in which Philip actually speaks. And so I want you to read that line with me. I will do one of these when it's time to read that line. All right. We hear from the book of Acts, the 8th chapter. Then an angel of the Lord said to Philip, "Get up and go toward the south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is a wilderness road." So he got up and went. Now there was an Ethiopian eunuch, a court official of the Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, in charge of her entire treasury. He had come to Jerusalem to worship and was returning home, seated in his chariot. He was reading the prophet Isaiah. Then the Spirit said to Philip, "Go over to this chariot and join in." So Philip ran up to it and heard him reading the prophet Isaiah. He asked, "Do you understand what you are reading?" Well, he replied, "How can I, unless someone guides me?" And he invited Philip to get in and sit beside him. Now the passage of Scripture that he was reading was this: like a sheep, he was led to the slaughter, and like a lamb silent before its shearer, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied him. Who can describe this generation? For his life is taken away from the earth. The eunuch asked Philip, "About whom, may I ask you, does the prophet say this? About himself or about someone else?" Then Philip began to speak, and starting with this scripture, he proclaimed to him the good news about Jesus. As they were going along the road, they came to some water, and the eunuch said, "Look, here is water. What is to prevent me from being baptized?" He commanded the chariot to stop, and both of them, Philip and the eunuch, went down into the water, and Philip baptized him. This is the word of the Lord. All right. Well, raise your hand here. Raise your hand if you agree with this statement. We live in a strange world and a strange time. Raise your hand if you agree. I agree. For example, if you're wondering about that question, might I point to the presidential election? Strange? Strange, right? Or speaking of strange, think about the last time you were all together with your extended family, maybe your in-laws. Strange? Oh, come on. Strange, right? Or another example, I was begrudgingly mowing my lawn for the first time this year, and all I could think of is how strange it is that we water and fertilize our lawns, do everything we can to make it lush and green, knowing that it only means we're going to have to mow that darn lawn even more. Strange, right? If you ask me, we live in a strange world. And our story for today fits that theme. It's a strange one, this story. It's a strange one by all accounts. You see, first off, we have this guy by the name of Philip, who is this little-known Bible character. And Philip was doing his own thing here in this story when an angel appeared to him. And if an angel appearing isn't strange enough, the angel gives Philip a command, and it's an odd command at that. He tells Philip he's supposed to go toward the south, to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. What's unusual about this command is that in the ancient world, there was nothing on that ancient road. The only thing on that road were a few deserted ruins of ancient towns. It was a thoroughfare that took you all the way to Egypt. Philip was told to go on a journey with no real destination, and strangely, he obliges. And they're on this strange journey. This journey that had no destination, he has a bizarre encounter. You see, out there in the middle of nowhere, he meets an odd visitor, someone who had no business being there. The Bible calls him an Ethiopian eunuch. Now, in the ancient world, Ethiopia was this strange and exotic place. It was considered the end of the world in mythology of the time. This is where gold was plentiful and peacocks and elephants ran wild. It was a place of mythical proportions where people had tight, curly hair and dark skin, so dark they called it burnt. And strangely, this Ethiopian, who had no business being in this part of the world, he was sitting in his chariot reading from a scroll. He was reading from the Hebrew book of Isaiah. And in this odd story today, for some reason, Philip, who's out on this road to nowhere, he ran alongside that chariot and struck up a conversation with this stranger from this far-off land, only to have that Ethiopian ask Philip to baptize him in a mud puddle on the side of the road. Folks, any way you look at this story, it's a strange story. It's a strange story about a strange encounter with a strange visitor in a strange place that ends in a strange baptism. And to be quite honest, when I look at this story, we haven't even touched on the strangest detail in this story. You see, the strangest detail in this story is the answer this Ethiopian gives to a question that Philip asks out there on that dusty road. You see, Philip is running alongside that Ethiopian who's reading away, sitting in his chariot, and that's when Philip says, "Hey, do you understand what you're reading?" And the strangest line in our entire reading is the Ethiopian's answer. He says these words, "How can I understand unless someone guides me?" Let me read that again. How can I understand unless someone guides me? Now, folks, bear with me for a second. If you ask me, this is one of the strangest, most unlikely statements anyone could make in our world. How can I understand unless someone guides me? Let me explain. Men, you're driving down the road, not quite certain where you are going, not quite certain how to get to your final destination. What do? Yeah, you don't lie in church. You don't ask for directions. I know you. I'm one of you, huh? You do anything but ask for directions, right? And how many of you men, raise your hand if you know something about home repair and improvement. Raise your hand. Be honest here, right? I'm going to write your names down because I know nothing. I know nothing. My dad was a preacher and he gave me no skills whatsoever, huh? And the funny thing is, every time something breaks at our house, I feel embarrassed to call for help. I should be able to fix these things on my own. And so if something breaks, I do what we all do. I Google it, right? Do you know how many do-it-yourself videos are out on Google? Huh? And women, it's the same for you. It's called Pinterest, right? Some of you know about this Pinterest, all these do-it-yourself projects. Menards, right? Fleet Farm, Home Depot, all these big box stores continue to do record business because when it comes to home repair and improvement, you can do it yourself, right? Folks, don't we live in a world today that tells us, whatever you do, don't ask for help. Do it yourself. You can make it on your own. And so let's go back to the story. When the Ethiopian says, "How can I understand unless someone guides me?" I say, he's not one of us, obviously. Because if he were one of us, he'd never ask for help. Whether it's home improvement or politics, finances, relationships, even our mental health, I don't need a guide. I can figure it out all on my own, thank you very much. What that Ethiopian says is strange. Because I think most of us have been taught from an early age, whatever the issue or the matter at hand, we can do it ourselves. I grew up in a good Midwestern home where we were taught that there are certain things, even with family, that you just don't discuss. They don't need to be discussed. You figure certain things out on your own. I'll never forget talking to my grandma before, God rest her soul, around the time of a presidential election. And I asked her, Grandma, how do you think the rest of our family would feel about our politics? I said to her, to which she responded, I thought I raised you right. You know, there are two things you never talk about when with the whole family, politics and religion, right? Politics and religion are private matters. We don't talk about them. Like not asking for directions, there are certain things you can figure out on your own. Now, when that Ethiopian asks for help from Philip, he's obviously not one of us. But folks, having said that, if we could be ever so honest just for a minute, when it comes to faith, I have this hunch. I think there are many of us who deep inside would love to say the same thing that Ethiopian said. How can I know? How can I know unless someone guides me? See, I could be wrong, but I think, folks, when it comes to faith, many of us have long since forgotten those Bible passages we had to memorize for confirmation 40 years ago. Still, others of us grew up in homes where faith just wasn't talked about. And there are still others of us, I think, who come to church and we sit in our pew and we look at those good-looking folks in the pew right down the aisle there, and we get this feeling every time we come that everyone else in church knows a lot more about the Bible and this faith stuff than I do. What's kind of funny is they're looking at you saying the same thing. I think we're not all that unlike that Ethiopian. How do I know unless someone guides me? See, folks, I can't tell you how many times I've heard people say, I can't possibly get involved in a Bible study or this or that ministry. I don't know enough about this faith stuff. What they're saying is, how can I unless someone guides me? I wish someone would walk with me like that Philip did. Folks, somewhere along the way, something terrible happened in the church. Somewhere, someone convinced us that faith was all about right living and right answers. But folks, hear this. Even the Ethiopian in our story knows this isn't true. If you notice, the Ethiopian didn't say to Philip, how can I understand unless someone gives me all the right answers? What he says is, how can I understand unless somebody guides me? How can I understand unless someone guides me? He's looking for a guide. He's looking for a companion. Next week, 26 members of Calvary will depart from this place and head to the Holy Land of Sweden and Norway. And as we arrive in Stockholm, Sweden, we'll be met by a guide who our tour company has promised us will be with us morning, noon, and night until we board our plane and head home. And I, for one, am thankful for this because not a one of us speaks Norwegian or Swedish in the entire group. Now, I've led several tours like this. And for example, a crew from Calvary traveled to Israel and Palestine a couple of years ago. And there at the airport, as we landed, we were greeted by our tour guide. His name was Giovanni. Giovanni was an excellent guide. In fact, hands down, he was the best guide I've ever worked with. He was born and grew up in Palestine and now lived in Israel. He led us all over the streets of these cities and towns in the Middle East where he had grown up. And these were the places where the Bible story played out. He lived there in this place where there was this messy Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a conflict that had been a part of his entire life. Now, as our guide, yes, he took us all over and he shared plenty of history. But what made him a really, really fabulous guide was that he had this way of sharing not only history, but he shared his own story. He shared what it was like to grow up in this place of history and conflict and beauty. He shared what it was like to go to school there, to get married there, to raise kids there. You see, what I've learned from these guides is that a good guide doesn't have to have all the answers. A good guide must simply be willing to share their story. Remember, that Ethiopian said, "How can I understand unless someone guides me?" Folks, I'm going to bet that somewhere along the way, some guide, some Philip character in your life shared their story with you. They opened their life to you and shared a little bit about their faith with you and how these things can sometimes be beautiful and sometimes messy. I'm guessing you are here, you attend this place, because someone shared their faith with you way back when. They were your guide, your companion. You see, it was true for me. One of my favorite things as a kid was spending time with my grandpa out on my grandparents' farm. And there on that farm, there was a routine to life. Every morning, Grandma would cook that big old farm breakfast with pancakes and eggs and bacon and sausage and toast and ham and homemade jam. And we'd all sit down around that big table, that big old farm table. And when we were done eating, my grandpa, he would pull out his Bible that sat vertically in this napkin holder on the counter. And he'd read a passage and we'd say a prayer together. And then my grandpa would turn around to the little sink that was also in the kitchen, and he'd reach into his mouth and he'd take out his teeth, and he'd brush those teeth, he'd stick them back in his mouth, he'd go slip on his coveralls, and I'd follow him out to the barn. And there in the barn he'd work, and I'd tag along, and I'd ask him all kinds of questions about his life and growing up on the farm. And every once in a while, we'd talk about faith and what it means to be children of God. You see, Grandpa didn't have all the right answers. Grandpa had made mistakes in his life. But Grandpa was one of my guides. He shared his story with me. Folks, it's occurred to me that each of us have our own story, don't we? Some of our stories have some bumps along the way, some highs, some lows. Some of us have strange stories like Philip. Some of us think our stories are boring, but we all have a story. And a good guide is simply willing to share their story. This last week I had the privilege of attending the funeral of a dear, dear woman. You see, Katie Christensen, some of you know her, she works here at the church. Her grandmother passed away. And though I didn't know her, it was clear from the funeral that she had been a guide. Because as her family members got up and talked about her, they shared story after story about how stories that she had no doubt told them. Stories about how when she was a young teacher at a Catholic school, she stood up to a priest who demanded her students attend chapel each and every day, even though it was winter, and they were in rural North Dakota, and there wasn't a lick of heat in that old chapel. She protested, and she got fired. Family members told stories about how, as a student, she herself, she boycotted this awards banquet when she was just a student, and it created this big stir. And she did it because African American students, who were just as deserving as her, weren't allowed to attend that banquet. Folks, I think this story today reminds us that each one of us has a story that needs to be shared. Because all of us need guides, companions on this journey, just like that Ethiopian. We need one another. Faith isn't like biology or studying literature. Faith is first and foremost, it's not a head thing. Faith isn't about knowing stuff. Faith is a heart thing. Like that Ethiopian, I think we are all looking for people who will be our guides, our companions. Because we know this is true, here at Calvary we've made some changes, right? About how we do things like Christian education. We know that faith is passed on when we, like Philip, share our stories. We share our questions. We share why faith is important. With our young people, confirmation looks different today. We believe the most important relationship in a young person's life is their parents And what's most important to their faith development is their parents' willingness to share their faith with their son or daughter. And so on Wednesday nights, we gather here, all those kids in this sanctuary, along with their parents. And together we worship together, we talk together, we serve together, we learn together. And we know that it makes for a long evening for those families, but it makes a difference. Faith isn't about right answers. Faith is caught when we share our stories. Well, if you're here, which we all are, it's likely a guide showed up in your life. Someone like Philip. Someone who shared their story, stretching and inspiring you that you too enter into a lifelong journey wrestling with faith. And so tonight we give thanks for those people, those guides, and we hear also an invitation tonight. An invitation to be guides like Philip, companions with others on the journey of faith by simply sharing our own story, a story that God has planted deep within you. Thanks be to God. Amen.
As we prepare to collect